Welcome back to another episode of Coaching with the Bible. This is episode 164, season 4, episode 4, our topic of the week, moral courage. It's sort of picking up where we left off a couple of weeks ago when we spoke at length about moral clarity. Let's go deeper into moral courage. It's been a bloody week here in Israel. Let's talk a little bit about that first, because it does affect the topic and why I'm coming back to the issue of moral clarity in this space, specifically more on the courage side, because the world opinion seems to continue to turn away from Israel and increasingly towards pressuring for a ceasefire, for some sort of a pause in the fighting for reasons related to humanitarian aid, to getting citizens of Gaza out or to safer areas. No talk of releasing the hostages, anything like that. And statement after statement after statement after statement after tweet after post after article after interview is in the zone of being, or feels like being in that space of not standing for Israel. Actions on college campuses seem to be getting worse. The United States Congress is starting to splinter, even as today they voted to provide an aid package, a very large aid package for Israel. But of course, it's led with condemnations and other people calling for ceasefires and recalibrating Israel's response. I would say to you that today or this evening, in preparing for this presentation, that I broke a little bit emotionally. There have been tears, certainly over the last number of weeks, but for some reason today, sort of broke, and there was just a free flow of tears about this. I don't know why today, but today it did happen that way. I'm not embarrassed to say that out loud here or to share that with you. You've been with me for 3+ years at this point, so you know where I'm at, and even though that I'm not particularly an emotional guy in that way, it does happen on occasion, and obviously this is a highly evocative emotional time, and something, I don't know what it is, pushed me over today. But I would say that for much of me is an increasing level of frustration with world opinion. Not that I care so much, and I really hope on some level that the Israel Defense Force and the leaders that are leading the charge in this moment, in this war, also don't heed it, but fight until it's over, until the enemy is destroyed. But if you're listening, you're paying attention to some of it, it can be disheartening, and it can be frustrating, and it can be maddening, and it can be mind-numbing, and it can be mind-boggling, and it can feel like we're in the upside down and that the world is topsy-turvy, and what bizarro planet are we on when you read or hear or listen to some of the people speak about this subject. What they're willing to put the mental gymnastics in their mind through to reinterpret or re-understand a statement that somebody seems to be saying very clearly, very openly, and trying to spin it in a way that it's not the case, or to deny that certain things are happening the way that they're happening, or to deny that people are walking around the streets in different places around the world pulling down posters of kidnapped children, or to deny that certain groups, typically speaking humanitarian groups in the world, have not uttered a word about the hostages. They seem to flow freely when they're talking about actions in Gaza by the Israel Defense Force. But as it relates to those that were killed here in Israel, oh yeah, it's a given. Of course I condemn. When it comes to the hostages, not a word. Not a word. It's like, what in the world is going on here? And it feels very morally bankrupt. We'll say that way. That there's a corruption in the ethical value set of a lot of people, and you have to wonder why. When you compare it to other things that are going on in the world where there is no condemnations and there are no statements and there's no rioting or marching in the streets or none of that, it only happens towards Israel, you have to wonder why. And it goes to the core of this idea of being, in the nicest way to say it, inconsistent, or maybe uneducated, might be a better term for the lightest version of this, to just purely being bankrupt, to having no morals, ethics, values whatsoever. Like, I think we could expect more from people. I think we should expect more from people. I think we should demand more from people, from our elected officials, whoever they may be, and really stand for what's right and stand for what is good in the world and stand for what is needed in this world, which is clearly a victory against Hamas, an utter destruction of everything that Hamas is and stands for. I don't think that's too crazy a statement to make. But when you don't hear it, you don't get it, you don't see it, you don't read it, you go to morally bankrupt. And it doesn't make it feel any better, because when they're morally bankrupt, usually right next to morally bankrupt is some sort of like anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist, anti-Israel bias. While you can uncover it, it doesn't make it better, but it's there. Years ago, I mentioned this. I taught a course on the Middle East conflict, and one of the things that we spent a lot of time on in that course, this was for kids. Initially, it was for kids who were seniors in high school heading off to college campuses and needed to be prepared to speak about Israel on a college campus because they were going to be representing Israel, whether they liked it or not. They were going to be representing Israel on those campuses. This started 15 years ago when I started teaching the course. So it was before this version, a virulent version of what's going on campuses was going on, but it was already the case there, and it was already clear that by the time they got to campus, it was too late, so they needed to preempt it, and so 12th grade was where we started to teach it. But already, on some level, I think 12th grade was probably too late. But we spent a lot of time in the course not just simply understanding the conflict, not justifying both sides, but understanding what the arguments are on both sides. 1. 2, developing a skill set to be able to, as I mentioned last week, to arm ourselves in the ability to debate and discuss and converse effectively on all the different issues. 2. And then to have the conversation on the very difficult issues, let's say, around what's going on here or what people are claiming. Whether that was issues with respect to right of return in the past, what's still there. The issue of occupation, which you hear a ton about now. When you hear about colonizers and decolonization, all that stuff. You got to be able to answer that. You have to be able to talk about it. You have to know how to have that conversation. You need to know enough facts to be able to put that into a cogent argument. But those were hard conversations. I used to really press the students on that subject. I'd flip it over and play the role of the pro-Palestinian perspective to really dig and to really needle at what they were arguing so that they could become better at what they were doing. Super important. Vital. Even if they weren't going to a campus and having those conversations out loud, they needed to know it for themselves, because when you continue to read the vitriol and the hate and the bias and the morally bankrupt and the morally unethical and all that other stuff as it relates to Israel, some of that starts to creep in, and you got to be strong enough to handle that conversation. And if you're not, well, we should expect that you could do better. And so one of those key conversations was really around moral issues. And the specific example that I used to always bring was the case of somebody who had been dispelled from their home in 48 to a refugee camp, and now is into generation 3 or 4 in that refugee camp, and has this idea, this notion of the right of return, but can't go back. And so I put a face on it, I'd put a name to it, I'd really describe it and really develop it so that it became like very real for my students. And on the flip side, I would describe the scenario of someone who just decided that they're going to move to Israel from pick your country in the West, and then they have citizenship and they can live there and they can vote and they can earn a living, and amazingly, in my scenario, they now live in that person's home. So how do you talk about that? How do you make the moral argument that that's legit, legally, morally, ethically? You're not looking to convince necessarily somebody on the other side of that, but maybe somebody in the middle who's not really clear about how these issues work. You have to have an answer, and you can't be morally bankrupt there. And so it takes a level of clarity, moral clarity, which we talked about a couple of weeks ago. And it takes moral consistency on these issues, because you've got to be consistent. People have to be able to expect that your morality will be in place and in check each and every time. And you really can't slip up at any moment, because then you've created a hole in your armor and you're not then in a position to argue. And then you need moral courage, which ultimately was the key to any of this conversation, any of this debate. Anything that a person was going to do was going to require a heavy dose of moral courage. And moral courage, after you've developed moral clarity and moral consistency, moral courage is the courage to take action for moral reasons despite the risk of adverse consequences. Moral courage is the key to all of it. You can have the moral values, you can have the consistency in your argument, in your mind, and how you think and how you feel. But courage is the action verb, the action that you take. Famous quote from Mark Twain: "It's curious that physical courage should be so common in the world, and moral courage so rare." It's true. You see people backing down. You see people unprepared. You see people sounding dumb around some of this. You see people playing the role, quote unquote, of the useful idiot. It's bad. As I said a couple of weeks ago, if you have a problem with this, then we have a problem. If you can't do this, then we are in danger, because the chain of the armor locked in together, hand in hand, is not as strong if everyone is not as prepared. And so we need to do a better job. And so moral clarity and moral courage are really important. And it comes to us actually from this week's portion, which is why we're talking about it here today. Over the 3 years that we have already done coaching with the Bible on this portion, we've done some very heady topics. The first year we got heavy into Abraham leading up. The idea that Abraham's going to argue with God about the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. It's an incredible story. We're going to come back to that tonight. We talked about, Abraham getting aligned with Isaac around what's happening. These are heady topics that leaders need to know about. And in the course of what we've been doing the last few weeks, which is admittedly different than we've done for the first 3 years, and as I said, we'll get back to some of that stuff, and we'll do our best to really rein it back in, I promise. But here this week is this conversation around morals. And in the portion itself, the stories of Abraham, every single one of the little vignettes, little and big vignettes in this week's reading, is a moral dilemma. Moral dilemma. We have them. It's not simply just a person who has like a decision to make. Should I buy this? Should I buy that? That's not the moral dilemma. Moral dilemmas are like deep-seated issues. A person has to really wrestle with something that's going on to make a decision. Go through the reading, everything that's happening. I picked out, I think, 10 different moral dilemmas that are going on. In each one of those, you can pull from a different thread, to see who is the protagonist at that moment, and then you can see what's the dilemma that each one is facing. It goes from Abraham to Sarah to Lot to the daughters of Lot to God on high. Every one of them is bringing in some sort of a moral dilemma at play. Even the king Abimelech, the king of Gerar, who Abraham meets and deals with in multiple occasions in this week's portion, also grappling with moral issues. And so when you're doing the research, you're doing the homework, and you're looking at how we understand it, so it seems to be, from my understanding about it and what I read, in preparing for this presentation, is that there are at least 6 different categories of moral dilemma. 6 different categories of moral dilemma that are out there. And that when you start to prepare yourself and practice and work on yourself for it, you start to then do what needs to be done to figure it out. What kind of dilemma is this? Let's take an example in this week's portion. Isaac is born. But Isaac is not Abraham's first son. He is his first son through Sarah, but he's not his first son overall. His first son overall is Ishmael. Ishmael is the son of Hagar, as it's pronounced in English. At a certain point in time, once Isaac is born, Sarah's had enough. She's had enough. She doesn't want him around anymore. She doesn't want Ishmael to be there in the home any longer. She wants Isaac to grow up a certain way without the influence of an older sibling, half-brother, who is a negative influence, let's say. And she says to Abraham, you have to send him out. You got to kick him out. He's gone. He's out of here. So Abraham's stuck. On the one hand, side A is his wife, Sarah, who's been through everything with him, who's been his partner throughout, who now has a child, the child that they believe is the one that God has been speaking to them about. He has to listen to her. On the other side is his firstborn son, which he doesn't want to disregard or just toss to the wind. And he wants both. The Bible describes that he's pained by having to make this decision. He doesn't want to make the decision. So he's in a moral dilemma. He has like this situation. Like, what kind of dilemma is that? What's forcing the circumstance in this dilemma? What's the core of that kind of a situation for him that he's now battling? And then in the end, he doesn't have to make the decision. He has to act on the decision. The decision is made by God. God says, hey, look, listen to your wife. You have to do this. You might not like it, but you have to do it. And then he does, which must have been brutal. I remember learning many years ago with one of my teachers, midrashic text that describes that during the course of the years after Ishmael is kicked out, that Abraham goes to visit him on a couple of occasions, at least tries to. It's a very powerful text. But that's tearing Abraham apart. And there are a bunch of those that go on in this week's portion. Look at them. You can sort of see how they work, how they roll, what kind of things are going on. You can look at the different kinds of moral dilemmas, and it's very valuable and meaningful. If you're a leader, that can be in any environment, in your home, at work, whatever the relationships may be, to see some of the different types of moral dilemmas that exist and figure out, okay, what kind of dilemma is this? What's going on here? So let me give you an example. Something that's an example, it's an easy one, is called the self-imposed moral dilemma. A self-imposed moral dilemma is a situation that's been caused by the individual's own mistakes or misconduct. The moral dilemma is self-inflicted. And so this causes a number of complications when attempting to make a decision. So you screwed up something, right? And now you have to get out of it. Now you're in a dilemma because in that situation, you now have to put yourself at risk. So let's say, for example, you are an accountant and you fudge the numbers on something, and now it's been exposed, but it's not clear that it was you. But if you admit it, you'll lose your job. If you don't admit it, the company is going to get crushed. It's a self-imposed or self-inflicted dilemma. It is a legitimate dilemma. So there are at least 6 categories of moral dilemma that I came across in the reading. And I think many of the different dilemmas that come up here in the reading very much fit into those different categories. And so it's worth looking into. And so the deeper ones, the biggest 2, which sort of set off on different sides of each other, are the first, which is the story of God telling Abraham that he's going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And on the other side of that is the binding of Isaac. Those are not the same dilemma. They pull at different threads and fibers and core fundamental principles of who Abraham is. In the first one, God has the first dilemma because God's like, hey, should we invite Abraham into this conversation? Should he know about this? I mean, I'm going to make him a very important nation in the world. He's going to be the father of justice and righteousness and goodness in the world. Maybe he should participate in this conversation. And then God invites Abraham into this justice conversation. And Abraham prosecutes, on some level, quote unquote, God in this space of how in the world can you do this? What's the justifiability of destroying a city or a set of cities because they misbehaved? Is that the only solution? It seems to be. It's binary on some level, which is either as Abraham tries to negotiate for 50 and 45 and 40 and 30 and so on, and if we don't find them, it's destroyed. Can we make another option? Does not seem to be the case. You imagine that in those cities, that not everybody was evil. That in the city of Sodom, let's say, there were little children, babies, who had not yet lived long enough to have perpetrated any sort of evil or moral dysfunction on the world. And yet God seems pretty comfortable, for lack of a better term, destroying the city. Abraham, not so much. And so he tries to wrestle with God in that space, but it's like a pull. Like, is this justifiable? Is it not justifiable? Am I in a position to even have this conversation with God? Is this okay to mete out justice to everybody, and then therefore you're causing suffering to the righteous among the evil? That's a heavy moral dilemma. That's big. It's much bigger than Abraham. On the flip is the one that happens at the end of the story, which is the binding of Isaac. In that situation, what's the conflict, right? Conflict there seems to be very simply, it's Abraham has to wrestle with himself. God says, hey man, I want you to take your son up to that mountain and I want you to offer him as a sacrifice. So nobody else knows about it. Nobody else hears about it. But it goes against every fiber of his being to do what it is that God is asking him to do. He has spent his entire career arguing and debating in public, living his life a certain way, certainly going rabidly against any sort of a practice that would include sacrificing his child. And yet that's the commandment. So he's commanded to do so. And so now the dilemma is, does he follow his conscience, and his emotional feelings for his son, or for what he believes to be his legacy now slipping away from him, or does he heed God's commandment? Like, it's huge, heavy stuff. So Abraham, through the course of the week, is plodding through these different instances. Some of them are bigger, some of them are smaller, but there are all kinds of moral dilemmas that he's going through. And amazingly, he maintains his moral consistency. He is clear-eyed for what he has to do. And he has the moral courage to act upon it, without arguing with God in that way. I imagine Isaac, and we know Isaac to have been a very righteous person, doesn't warrant being slaughtered on a mountaintop, sacrificed. And yet, in that circumstance, Abraham does not argue with God. Maybe he's wrestling and he's struggling with it. But it's clear from the text that even if he's struggling with it, he's going to do it. He does raise the knife up in the story, but he's pulled. And so the question that we're wrestling with here, whereas Jacob later on actually wrestles with the angel, here Abraham is wrestling with himself, and he's wrestling with God on a moral level purely, and then obviously as it carries forward into his actions. How do we do with our moral dilemmas? Are we morally consistent? Are we clear-eyed? Do we have the courage to stand up and to speak out when necessary, and to do what's necessary when the moral moment arrives? I mean, that's a huge question. It's a huge question right now for us as people, and it's a huge question for the world. It would appear or feel like certain people in the world do not have the capacity for some of this because, I mentioned before, they're morally bankrupt. They don't have the moral courage of someone who saved Jews in the Holocaust. They don't have the moral courage to stand up publicly and denounce hate. Or, just to use it as an example, the courage of that, it was a young religious Jewish gentleman who stood in the middle of an anti-Israel protest and stood there on a chair, wrapped in his tefillin, arm and head, singing Hebrew songs. One man alone in that. Amazing. With the courage to physically go fight in the war. That's the courage. I mean, that's everything. And do we have that? We need it. That's the spine that we're looking for. And the Bible here at this point, in this story of Abraham, is, again, plucking at different threads and pulling on different aspects of morality, because fundamentally we are supposed to be a moral, ethical beacon in the world. If Abraham is the father of justice, let's say, then we are the people of justice. And we are the people of morality. And we are the people of ethics and values. And we are the people who hold ourselves to, I'm going to use the term, a disproportionately high level of morality. It's clear the rest of the world does too. They're holding us to this double standard that is, massive. But at the same time, we have to hold ourselves to that, and we have to be that, and we have to live that, and we have to execute at that level. We have to prepare ourselves for it, and we have to be ready for it each and every moment, every time it comes up, to meet the moment. Some of us do. Some of us don't. And certainly if we're going to rely on people from around the world to do this for us, we're going to be sorely disappointed. Because aren't you disappointed? You may not be surprised, but disappointed, frustrated, angry, upset, shell-shocked by some of it. Read some of the literature, some of the articles, and listen to some of the conversations that people are having about how they feel or how hurt they are because people who they thought were with them aren't or haven't been or haven't even reached out to just see how they're doing. That's not moral bankruptcy. That's mean. But that's where we're at. And so the Bible is pushing on this point, heavy and hard. And we have to step into those voids and put ourselves in positions, not to put ourselves in danger. I'm not advocating anyone putting themselves in danger, but standing up for their friends, neighbors, family, community, people, country, in whatever way that is. But publicly so, forcibly so, proudly so, in all those different dimensions. Because that's what the moment seeks. That's what the moment needs. That's what we need. And even though we caught a glimpse of it maybe for like half a day, and yes, certain countries, there's no question, certain leaders in the free world are supporting Israel, and I think that's really important. And when we're looking for cues, or we're looking for how we see ourselves, or where we should think about how are we doing, we should look vis-a-vis those more than the rest, who are not even in the conversation of being moral at all in some cases. But this is where we step up, and this is where we step in, and this is minimally for ourselves, maximally for our people. It's teachable, it's learnable, it's now. And every single one of us can do a better job of it. Every single one of us can prepare more for it, and every single one of us can do more around it. There's no reason why we should be bystanders in this moment, but we can be people who step into the void. We can be people who step into that fire, for lack of a better term, and do what's necessary when necessary for family, friend, community, people, and country. To finish out with a quote, as we do almost every week, this is a quote from Robert F. Kennedy. Few men are willing to brave the disapproval of their fellows, the censure of their colleagues, the wrath of their society. Moral courage is a rarer commodity than bravery in battle or great intelligence. Yet it is this one essential, vital quality for those who seek to change a world that yields most painfully to change. That is Coaching with the Bible for this week. I hope you are safe. I hope you are well. I hope you feel the love of our people, and feel the love of your friends and your family. Keep the faith, keep strong. Ultimately, victory will come our way. Have a great week.
Recording stopped.